So my break in studies ended up getting approved. I was hesitant to return because I just felt like the culture at Central wasn't very welcoming of people with disabilities. Like the disability services manager would always be very like, well, that's not a reasonable adjustment, and she'd sort of dictate what was and wasn't a reasonable adjustment, and she'd like always talk about social models and not really sort of help support the individual, so that was quite frustrating. And then also an incident had occurred in the third term where I was getting one of my DSA taxis, and this DSA taxi starts to just drive away, and I'm like, that's weird. So I quickly run and like knock on the door, and anyway, who should step out but the principal? And she's like, oh, hi, and then looks at my badge to find out my name, and she's like, Sabra, and I'm like, yeah. I'm like, oh, this is my taxi. And she went, this is your taxi. I was like, yeah, so this is the text I have, and that's the registration and stuff, unless you want to go to my address. And then she looked up and down at me, and then looked at the taxi and went, you take Addison Lee's? As in to say, like, you're not important enough to take an Addison Lee. This is the principal. Well, yeah, funnily enough, Disabled Students Allowance does have an agreement with Addison Lee to transport disabled students to and from their universities and their placements if they have them. So yeah. So that was the third term. So when you kind of experience things like that, it makes you think, well, actually, am I honestly going to be treated any better if I return? Anyway, I decided I was going to try, at least it was worth a try, so I emailed the programmes officer. Anyway, they said they'd get back to me within sort of 12 weeks from when I was about to start. They didn't, so I contacted them. They said, oh yeah, you have to engage, we expect engagement with the disabilities team. So I have to go through this annoying disability services manager and everything, and it's just a nightmare. And then they kind of messed around with the back to study interview date. So they scheduled it for a specific date, then cancelled it, decided the course leader wasn't going to be present, and then I had the interview with one of the programmes officers, and I don't know, it was like head of inclusion, which is a joke because Central is not inclusive, as we now know. So anyway, they're like, yeah, we're happy for you to come back, blah, blah, blah. I explained the situation about me being worried that my DSA support isn't going to be in place on time because it's so last minute, because realistically they need 4 working weeks, and this was before Easter and before the coronation as well of King Charles. So there was no way my support was going to be in place in time. The programmes officer just didn't seem to understand. He was like, yes, things are back in place. Like, he just wasn't listening, and it was so frustrating. And then the sort of inclusion person, he is also like a researcher. He got it a little bit, and he said, yeah, we'll, if necessary, the school will foot the bill for taxis to and from your placement if necessary. Anyway, I don't get my timetable till 5 days before starting back, so not even a week. Bearing in mind, for PCP, we have to do a presentation, and I literally don't know anyone in this new cohort, so it's a nightmare. I also look at the address on the placement, and sure enough, it is so inaccessible to me as a disabled student. This particular placement, was somewhere in southeast London, and it was about 2 trains, or 3 trains, 2 buses. They class that as accessible for someone with anxiety and who has sensory issues and is now on the road to being diagnosed autistic. That is, that is not doable. If I'm going to be quite honest, that's ridiculous. So anyway, I email back and I say, under no circumstances will I be attending that placement because it is so far away. I say I would rather work with a certain client group and I would rather put up with certain behaviours of a specific client group which they take offence to, and suddenly I'm pulled into a meeting. Basically, they're like, please confirm your attendance for next Monday. They want to have a meeting with me before I've even started. Anyway, I refuse point blank because I won't be there at that time because I'm just arriving into London at that particular time. So, because I'm coming from home, so I won't be there. So I say, look, I will speak to you at a later date. So I have this meeting a month later, and basically they get someone from the course team to come and represent the whole course team. She's like, I'm speaking for the whole course team. You are not meeting HEPC standards, blah, 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 blah. Bearing in mind, I sent this email before I even started. So why would I be subject to HEPC standards over something that is an accessibility need? Anyway, they basically asked me to explain myself, and they're like, oh, well, we didn't really understand that from your email and blah blah blah. Yeah, well, actually I tried telling you in my reply, but you weren't listening. So anyway, long story short, they're kind of half apologetic and they're a bit nicer to me at the end, but I am absolutely furious. I have a chat with my mum. My mum was listening on the phone the whole time. Really, I wanted her for backup and as a witness, really. So that happens. My new placement, I'm with 2 female students, 1 male student. It's in an LD home. The first sort of session, I knock on the client's door to let them know that like a drama therapy session is taking place, and they verbally abuse me and tell me to F off and effing and jeffing and stuff. Anyway, the supervisor will later turn around and say that it's my fault that they didn't turn up. Bearing in mind, they weren't always present in that home. So how is it my fault they didn't turn up to like drama therapy sessions? It's not. Like, I did not physically stop them from attending drama therapy sessions. They chose not to. There's a difference. This particular supervisor, I find her highly unpleasant. She is part of the core team. She makes out she's all about finding students' identities and everything else. Like, she's used as a poster child for Central. She's not. She's a liar. She is a liar, and honestly, like, so vile as a supervisor and as a tutor. Like, she's a nightmare. Like, they're all pretty bad, but she is the worst one in terms of manipulation. So I get there early the second week, and she walks up the stairs and turns around to me and says, why the other's not with you? I said, oh, they're eating breakfast, I think. They're like 5 minutes away. How long have you been here for? I said, since such and such a time. She's like, well, that's too early to turn up to placement. Then when she's with when the rest of the group come, she's like, I want you to all attend, like, I want you to all enter the building together and stuff. Bearing in mind, we're coming from different directions within London. Like, that's a joke. Then she also turns around to me and, I kid you not, says, so you think you're better than everyone else by turning up early? No, like, my taxi got me in early. Like, don't speak to me like that. Then, basically, I'm finding there are instances of, like, other students, like, potentially talking over clients. So she's like, so what is the need for quiet in the sessions? And I'm like, well, people need to shut up and be quiet because clients don't necessarily have the room for processing or room to speak. And she turns round, like in my last supervision session, like my one-to-one, and says, don't speak to them like that. You shouldn't speak to them like that. Yes, I could have worded it better, but they knew. I asked the group, were they really offended by it? And that one of them was like, well, I don't think you should have worded it like that, but I knew you didn't mean it like that. And I knew that there was like no malice in it, and they understood what I was saying. Okay, yes, it could have been worded differently. But anyway, in my also one-to-one supervision, she also turns around and she says, I kid you not, I think, you know, you've got this disconnect to people, and I'm just like, what the hell? And then she turns around and she's also like, but you know, you can work with teenagers, you could be a practitioner and stuff. And the only thing that annoys me is I make it pretty, like, she also asked me in front of the whole group, oh, where are your placements? I look at her and I'm like, I don't have any placements. So that really hurt as well. And then she carried on talking about the placements to other students in front of me, even though she knew that I possibly wasn't going to get into second year. Like, it was so hurtful. Also, during this term, there were 23 new students in the cohort, and I was the only one not to get provisional placements or a provisional supervisor. So I was completely excluded from that process. There was also, I didn't have half my disability support in place for half the term. I'm trying to think what else. I went to view the SIP, the performing research presentations, and there was one or two students that were quite unpleasant with me in different ways. So basically two of them like called over to me when they were in the foyer, and then I was like, would you mind if I walk up with you? And they're like, sure. And they're like, how are you? And I start talking, then they're like, oh, we're not really listening right now. It's like, well, why have you asked me how I am then? Then we're going up the stairs and I sort of like wait for them, and they look at me and they're like, we're waiting for you to open the door. And I just thought, that is so unpleasant. So I sat down, I felt a bit depleted because I was a bit like, oh, okay. And then basically most of the second years who were my original year group, they're lovely and they acknowledge me and they give me some lovely smiles and I'm made to feel quite welcome. But then there's one student, after they've completed their presentation, sits directly behind me. Doesn't say, hi, Sabra, how are you? Anything like that. She just sits behind me as if to like almost force a conversation. And then she looks at me and it's like, so what are you doing with your life then? So what are you up to, Sabra? And I was like, oh, I'm back in first year. I'm just redoing a unit. Oh, so you've had to do the whole thing? I said, no, just this term. Oh, and stuff. And then she just walked off like she just wanted gossip, like so nasty. And the thing is, that wasn't even a young student. This was like a student in their early 40s. They had been pretty unpleasant when I had been in that particular cohort. Like, I remember that same student actually told me that she was ambivalent towards my feelings. That person is now a qualified drama therapist, working with people with mental and emotional issues. So yeah, that's nice to know, isn't it? That you've got someone in the world in that capacity. So yeah, that was her. And then I got up to leave, and as I was getting up to leave, I started to walk past the door. It was like a black box theatre space with like roster seats and those sort of like gym bars. I look through the bars and I feel people watching me, and I look up and the two marking tutors, one of whom's a course leader and one of whom is like kind of like the subject lead for that particular unit, they're looking at me and they're just watching me just walk towards the door. And I'm just like, again, I'm met with that kind of hostility. There were also a few more times during that term when second year students were present, and there was one second year student who literally looked at me, sort of deadpan me, then continued to talk to someone, didn't smile, didn't anything, just to have a look, you know? So it was not easy returning in that respect either. I wasn't particularly encouraged to attend other classes. The email that I was sent about how the term would go was literally like, you needn't turn up to lesson, which, so for me, I didn't really feel welcome to go to any other classes, to be honest, and I felt very excluded and isolated. My placement group itself wasn't that bad, apart from there was one girl who I found was quite controlling. Like, possibly because of her anxiety, and she turned around to me one day and said, I don't think you're attuned to people, and I don't think you're this and that. And that was, honestly, that really upset me. And I stupidly turned around and I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, and I'm sorry you feel that way. And she's, but actually now looking back, I'm a bit like, Sabra, why did you apologise? You had nothing to apologise for. If someone spoke to me that way now, I would give them absolute grief, honestly. I later found out in the second cohort there were 6 other students who failed modules or units. I don't know how many of those people got into the second year, but put it this way, I'm pretty sure it's quite a few. So one rule was made for them and it was another for me as well. So extremely frustrating. Anyway, I ended up failing both placement practices 2 again and the MIF facilitation. Surprise, surprise. That other student in the placement group also turned up to my MIF facilitation without any notice. So yeah, that was kind of how she did it. I'm pretty sure it was revenge for how her placement facilitation went. She didn't brief the other placement people properly, and her placement her session didn't go smooth, which happens sometimes. Is every drama therapy session gonna go smoothly? I don't think so. Honestly, so it was just really frustrating. My tutor was okay, but he didn't really seem to understand that you can't always control when your medical appointments are when you have a disability. With the NHS, you can't just pick and choose. Sometimes there are going to be times when you have to miss class to go to appointments. Now, he encouraged me to cancel it and then rearrange it, which I did, which I totally regret. I wish I'd never attended that particular class, because in that particular class, this exercise where basically you had to talk about, what you do when you were working in a charity or working within the NHS or a school. And because I hadn't been placed, I didn't really belong to any group. Whereas if I'd gone to that appointment, I wouldn't have had to have dealt with that situation. So in a way, there were a lot of times when, honestly, I felt very misunderstood. I personally don't feel I was treated much better going back to Central for my after my break in studies. And I don't really feel like they were prepared to really put the support in. I felt like they only even awarded the break in studies because they felt like they had to, not because they really wanted to. I don't think they played fair at all. And yeah, I feel like I've been ripped off of my life savings, basically. There are certain experiences that I definitely would not have had living in London that I'm grateful for, and there's areas of healthcare that I've been able to work in London that I definitely wouldn't have been able to experience had I been living within Merseyside. But having said that, I don't think doing the course has enhanced my life prospects. I don't think it's helped me out professionally. I think it's made me even worse mentally. And I feel like it's been more of a detriment to me than of a benefit, really. And that's how I feel. I don't trust people anymore. I struggle a lot more with social anxiety than I used to. I'm constantly tearful. I'm not doing well. And honestly, the other thing that I don't like is people, a lot of these graduates, the drama therapy graduates, they're posting little photos, snippets of my life, and it's a very romanticized life, and it's not healthy. It doesn't represent realistic living in 2024 in a crumbling country under basically a government that is destroying the country. It's completely unrealistic and completely unrelatable to anyone who's working class. But to be honest, I feel like there is no support if you're disabled at that school. I don't think there's any support at Central if you're working class. I think if you come from a certain region of the country, that can negatively affect you as well. I don't think disability services are really there to support disabled students. I think it's more they're there to try and prevent people from suing them and just do the bare legal minimum. And yeah, that was my experience. I can't lie to you, like, yes, I probably would not attend there if I could have my life over again. And yeah, it's devastating. So I'm going to talk about red flags that I ignored in the final bit of this because I don't want to talk about this anymore. But yeah, that finishes this part off.